Okay, welcome back to another episode on Rust. Okay, so hopefully you had success giving this exercise a shot. So how do we do this? We want to create a function called display2. Well, let's just follow what these instructions are saying. Essentially, what I think this is kind of saying here is we're making a function that has this string object parameter and then pushes whatever that is, f8 tributo. All right, and that's what this function is doing. And then we have this variable. So we got our string allocation here, the default Ferrari, and then we want to pass that in and then modify the variable. So in Rust, it's a little bit more tricky, right? Because you have to understand the caveats and you have to understand memory allocation to be able to do this correctly. But of course, let's start with one step at a time. Always a good way to tackle any type of question with coding. Start small and then build. So the first thing is, let's make this function. So we're going to make another function, display2, and it's going to take a parameter of this car type. I'm going to call it car. You could call it whatever you want. I'm going to denote with this underscore just because we're working with this car variable and I just don't want to confuse you. And normally this would be mutable, and it's a string, so we'd bring in the string. But remember, this is going to be a reference that we're passing. So I'm going to use also the AND. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to push. We want to be pushing this string value. So remember the push method in Rust? Well, we can actually just bring it in with .push. We can access it. And particularly, we're going to use string because we're working with our string here, and we're going to say f8 tributo, like this. And this should push it. I'm also going to print, just to see that things are working out here. I'm going to print the car value, and we're going to pass in our car. Oops. And there we go. So now we have our function display2. We want this mutable parameter, passing in a reference, something that already exists. So we use AND. And then we have the push string method, which we're familiar with already. If you forgot, you just go back, and you can use this course as a glossary anytime when you're coding Rust. It's a great toolkit to just have if you want to jump into short videos. And there's the first part. Now the second part is we want to create this variable car, which is a string object with the default Ferrari. We want to call display2 passing in the car variable. All right, so let's do the first part. And we're going to push this where? Well, in our main function, right? If it's just going to be hanging out in nowhere land, then not much is going to come of it. So we want to make this variable. We want it to be mutable. It's going to be called car. We want the data type string. So you know what? I'm going to do string. And remember, it has to be uppercase. And since we have a default value, right, we want to push in Ferrari here as a default. Not push in, but that's what our default is. Remember, we have the new and from. Which one do we want to use? Well, we want to use from, right? Because we don't want it to be nothing. And we want it to be Ferrari, so I'm going to pass in Ferrari like this. And there you go. Okay, so now we have our string. Now we have our memory allocation here for string. And now we just need to call the function, this function display2, and pass in the argument, right? And remember, it has to work. It has to work. So how do we call it? Well, we could say display2. And remember, we want the reference. So we don't want actual car. We want a reference of it, so we can say and mute car like this. And just so we can see the result, let's go ahead and print it. All right, so we're going to say print, say the car has been updated to, and let's see, car. And this should show us the change, right? Because we are making a change. Remember, right now our string value is only Ferrari. But when we run display2, we should be pushing Ferrari F tributo on it. So let's run this code and see what happens. Oh, and let me actually just see, write exercise solution, so we have this separated. So let's go ahead and run the code. And fingers crossed, it works. Well, look at that. So we have the car value, which is Ferrari. And then we have the car has been updated to Ferrari F8 tributo, right? And there you go. It works. This is a working solution. And notice, the car value doesn't change, right? The car value doesn't change. But for the function, when we run the function, we get to reference it, we get to reference our variable, and then we get to update the car type to how we want to. And this is an example, and you just successfully completed an example of borrowing in its entirety in Rust, not just borrowing and modifying string objects with Rust. So excellent work, well done. I'm quite proud of your achievements. So have some coffee, go to the beach, hang out with your best friend, and when you're feeling excited to move on, which could also be right away, you don't need to take a break, I'll see you in the next lesson for more Rust. Okay, see you there. Bye-bye.